So, Galen, I want to get your thoughts on Greg Graham, who came in with a lot of hype, developed kind of slowly over time, but developed, like college players do. He didn't come in and wasn't just gangbusters right off the bat. But by his senior year, I distinctly remember a headline. I think it was after he scored 32 points against, or maybe it was after it was either after the Purdue game where he went 26 of 28 from the free throw line. But I think
Graham with two more coming. Up in the air it goes. Got it again. 31 now for Greg Graham. Looking for 32. And he got it. 32 points for Graham. It's 89-74. 44.
But I think it was after a Michigan State game on the road. And I don't know if it was a Hamill headline or someone else, but it said the best guard in America, with the idea being that by that point in his senior year, there was no guard in America playing better than Greg Graham. And that, even with Calbert Cheaney winning National Player of the Year and so many other good players at the time. And to me, that's always stuck out as just a microcosm of how he developed and what he became by the end of his career. What are your overall thoughts on the career of Greg Graham?
I think Greg Graham is one of the best underrated players in IU history from the standpoint that he kind of gets lost in the shuffle, similar to some of the other players that we've talked about, because he had a great player on the roster with him. In this case, obviously, it was Calbert Cheaney. Greg Graham's career, I think, is fascinating because you're right. I mean, he was part of that great recruiting class that came in 89-90, but he was not one of the most heralded people. I mean, by far, the most heralded person in that recruiting class was Pat Graham, who had won Indiana Mr. Basketball. And really, I think, if it wasn't for Pat Graham's terrible luck with injuries, I don't know that we would have seen Greg Graham develop into the player that he ended up becoming. Because by Pat Graham breaking his foot and then breaking his foot again and never really being able to be a part of the team during the time that squad got really, really good, like the 91, 92, 92, 93 seasons, it allowed Greg Graham a lot more minutes than he would have gotten otherwise. It allowed him to play alongside Calbert Cheaney constantly. It allowed him to play alongside Damon Bailey constantly. And that put the team in a position where a guy who had a lot of athleticism, but also had probably the sneakiest good shooting of any IU player in the modern era, it gave him a chance to shine where he might not have otherwise. I mean, what I loved about Greg Graham was his consistency, I think, above all else. Like, you rarely got a bad offensive effort out of Greg Graham. His defense could be a little up and down. Of course, he's the famous recipient of the...
If you're not going to recover Greg Graham...
Yeah, exactly.
But if you're not going to recover Greg Graham, if you're just going to let him drive by you...
But even that, I thought he made significant strides his junior and senior years as a defender. But his shooting is just incredible. I always marvel at that 92-93 season when, Calbert Cheaney scored. He shot 54.9% from the field and 43% from three-point range. Greg Graham shot better than that. Greg Graham shot 55% from the field and 51% from three. I mean, can you imagine a player doing that today, like a 6'4" guard doing that today? It's inconceivable. And the fact that you had two guys shooting over 54% and you had a situation, frankly, where those guys were on the floor all the time. I mean, Graham was playing, I think, 32 minutes a year his senior year. The fact that you got that level of consistency out of Greg Graham really made those teams what it was. It made them so hard to guard. It made them so difficult to match up against.
This is Graham. Nice fake. Count the basket. And a blocking foul is called on Greg. We'll talk more about that. Cheaney slips, but collects himself and scores. Such a
can do is when they do penetrate, eliminate the help with that kick for the three-pointer.
Nover has post on the wing.
Always moving.
Nice cut by Graham, moving without the behind. Troy Smith, bad pass. Cheaney inside to Graham, and Indiana makes Louisville. Matt Nover, Greg Graham, Pat Graham, inside to Cheaney for the slam. Over Rozier.
This is the timing and trying to guard these guys.
Graham is awfully quick.
Very few teams had the athleticism to be able to guard both Cheaney and Graham simultaneously, and even the teams that did generally had to rely on a big size advantage in the post rather than relying on being able to outquick or outshoot this IU team with Greg Graham on the floor.
And my favorite story that Greg has told many times, he might have told it on senior night. He told it a couple other times I've heard him talk about how he was so often mistaken for Calbert Cheaney around Bloomington, and people would ask him for Calbert's autograph, and he would just sign it as Calbert.
Yep. Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, Calbert got most of the headlines because, I mean, he was a legitimately great player. But Greg Graham, if you don't have Greg Graham playing at the level that he does his junior and senior years, that team doesn't recover from the loss of Pat Graham. Mm-hmm. And they don't have the flexibility of being able to rotate in, Jamal Meeks and Chris Reynolds, and when Jamal Meeks is on the floor, Graham can step in and help defensively. And when Reynolds is on the floor, Graham can take over offensive duties. And when Damon Bailey comes on the floor, they can send Damon down to the post and still have somebody out on the perimeter that's a threat both to drive and to shoot from long range. And, that sort of utilitarian player normally doesn't shoot that well and normally doesn't have that sort of athleticism. And, Greg deserves all the credit in the world for developing himself into a player that could do all of those things within the confines of the motion offense and within the confines of the talent levels of the other players on the team.
Yep. Well, thank you very much for your thoughts on Greg. I agree with you. One of the most underrated, probably underappreciated players in IU history.